Okay, we're going to jump right into it. Let me give a little bit of background for anybody who's here. I am going through an America's Christian Heritage Tour class. And what we're doing is going to take the historic spots that we are visiting in June. But before I do that, I'm laying a foundation. You're going to feel a little bit like in these couple of these, like you're in a history lesson. But what's funny is I don't want people to come up on these locations and go, oh, Christ Church. That's a nice church. And hear names like Winthrop and others and not know who we're talking about. So part of what I want to do in this course is for those even that are actually stretching from the Bay Area to multiple states who are going on the trip, is to just give a little bit of background about the places we'll be hitting. So we talked about the pilgrims coming across, right? Got that little foundation. But for a lot of people that when you talk about the pilgrims, people sit there and think, so how did the rest of the country get filled? Did the pilgrims kind of spread everywhere? And remember, we didn't find that. Remember, before the pilgrims, there was another settlement, a colony founded in 1608. They were who? The Jamestown settlement down in Virginia. And then the pilgrims came across, and they came across in what year? 1620. Right? They came across, they were heading for Virginia, top of Virginia, but they ended up blown off. And so we talked about the Plymouth Plantation. We looked at that. We're going to see that place. We're going to see the statue to the forefathers. But then what I did last time is, for those who weren't here, I talked about that migration, the Great Migration from 1620 to 1640. More people came across, where the separatists started to fill up the Pilgrim and the Plymouth area, right there. Above them in Boston and the greater Massachusetts, the Puritans started to come in. Now, just remember this and keep this separated because this will all make sense down the road when I start showing you these spots. I don't want to walk to the actual location until I've given you this background. Someone said to me, when are we getting to the historic spots? I go, well, I touched a few in Plymouth, but if I go right up to Boston and start hitting the Freedom Trail, you're going to see 16 spots we're going to hit, but you're going to go like, okay, what's that? I got to fill in that whole context. So remember this, in Virginia, down below, that they were largely Anglican. That's who founded that back in 1608 based upon the King James Charter. Up in New England, up here in Massachusetts, they were Puritans. They filled up in the Great Migration, and they filled up that spot up there. They were largely plantations down below in Virginia, and they were largely a lot of family steads, if you can say, up in New England. A lot of families. A lot of times it was a lot of single men, quite frankly, and married men that founded Virginia in the beginning. A lot of families, a lot of kids up in Massachusetts. You could have 20 families. 20 families could actually start a township for you. And you would gather together to be a general council of every little town, much like our own little town right here. When you got 50 families together, you actually were required to come up with a school. And that school had to be free for others. And yes, Jesus was taught in tons. So somehow get to that down the road. But there was a difference between the two of them. You could clearly see the House of Burgess, basically, back in England, started the Virginia settlement. And up in Massachusetts, they were looking for religious freedom and having the ability to be free from the king. So you get a lot of the framework for our revolution. So I want to show you a great video. There's a video series online which has hit millions of times. I think they use them in schools of all type. And for the most part, they do okay. We're not going to go there yet, but they call them Crash Course. And the guy who leads it is just hilarious. So I'm going to give you that in a moment. But in setting up this migration, I want to fill in a little bit of it, because what we're looking at is the seeds of revolution. What you want to think about, by the time we're going to be up in Boston visiting these places, we want to see the seeds that set the framework for this. Because from 1608 up into 1700, 1776. You had 150 years, and most people don't know anything about America or the colonies. So I'm going to fill that in a little bit more. Let's walk through these frames together, and then I'll show you this 9-minute video or 10-minute video, which is worth it. Just looking at my time. I could do this in a few minutes. 1600s and 1700s were years of revolution. What you need to see is we're going to go over these slides which cover these areas: a national revolution, political, religious, philosophical, and scientific. It all hit at once. And those were the seeds to the revolution. In the aftermath of the Reformation, the critical question was this. This is a great summary question put together by a historian. If neither a divinely ordained king nor one established church determines what's best, how does that change the ways that we understand our lives? You see, they're looking at it. If it's not the king and if it's not the church, which were the two dominant powers throughout Western civilization and civilization period, well then, where do we turn? Do you hear, we the people? I'm just saying. I mean, where do we turn for our lives and authority? Next one. Pilgrims, I'll just go over this real quick. Pilgrim separatists did not move to North America to establish religious freedom. They had it. They were having it to express themselves to be a colony where they already had religious freedom. They moved to the New World to establish a society based on their own beliefs and all that, which ran off the page. Next one. A separatist named Roger Williams, I talked about him a little bit last time, declared that the civil judges should not enforce religious beliefs. Remember, he came into Salem. We're going to talk, in this video clip, it's going to talk about the Salem witch trials. We'll get to that actually in one of these frames. But Roger Williams came into there, but he also declared, that the civil judges should not enforce religious beliefs, totally unlike how it was in England. But he also said this: the natives are the true owners of this land. That can get you kicked out of church. Just saying. And it did. So where did he go? Does anybody remember from last time? Rhode Island, that's right. Down to Providence, and he established that. Next one. After 3 months in the wilderness, Williams received shelter from a native tribe. In 1636, he bought a small bay from the natives, which became known as Providence, Rhode Island. Under the leadership of Williams, a radical idea was birthed in Providence: a civil government that refused to favor any specific religious beliefs. Do you hear, America? Okay, big things that impressed upon this. What he did in Providence, but also the Mayflower Compact was also big in significance. All of these just see as little seeds. Next one. This is one of the things he said. He said, no person in a Providence colony, no person within said colony shall be called in question for any opinion in matters of religion. Persons may enjoy their judgments in matters of religious concernment. That's from the original charter of the colony of Providence. Remember this in mind too, when you are reading the early founders. You can't look back on the way that we see the word religion now. Most of the time, and I mean this, most of the time, when they used the word religion, it was equivalent to Christianity. Okay, even though there were spatterings of others, and they could use this in the broad sense. Are you biting at the bit to say something? Webster's, I'm saying this for the people online because I know they won't be able to hear it. The original Webster's 1828. Oh, I hit that right. 1828, the original one, has the definition of religion as the Christian religion. So see, even into the 1800s. Now just say that was Webster's. And that was the definition that they carried over. So you got to be, I'm just saying you got to be careful. That doesn't mean religion can't include really religious freedom. But most of the time, that's what they were talking about. All 56 of our founders, all 56 had some connection to, or when I say 56, those are the Declaration of Independence, had connection to various denominations. There wasn't a Hindu among them, just letting you know. It was just for free. Anyway, next one. In a Bible study in her home, Anne Hutchinson, another big name, had declared that Christians were not bound to obey any human laws. She fled to Providence after being exiled from the Puritan colony. So she's up in the Boston area and comes down. Next one. I'm rushing through these. In 1692, just keep in mind we're all in the 1600s, but here we get in the Salem witch trials. Someone in Salem, Massachusetts claimed to have seen a 12-year-old girl practicing magic. Remember this. They are fancy-free Christians with a lot of liberty. What concerns them is what the Bible says, the way you're interpreting it. They turn to pastors and scholars, but much of the freedom you had, they didn't have from that high Anglican church back in England. And so they get rumor that the claim that 12-year-old girl is practicing magic. The girl and her friends falsely accused several older women of practicing witchcraft. This event led to hysteria, which came to be known as the Salem witch trials. Next. Next. Sorry. He's eating at the same time, like I'll be doing. 50 citizens accused of witchcraft provided confessions to the judges, and they were freed. But 19 accused citizens refused to confess their supposed guilt, and they were hanged. Next. A Puritan judge later confessed that the blame and shame of the Salem witch trials, still at least in the popular imagination, was a dark blot that blackened the Puritan experiment. And indeed, it was. So here's where I want to go with that. Thank you, sir. Perfect timing. Nice harmonica, by the way. Was that harmonica good? So here's what I want to do. Every time we're together for the 25 minutes or so that I have, again, I'm just giving you pieces leading up to this. So what I want you to do is kind of feel what was going on in the Massachusetts, the Rhode Island, the New York area, but I want you to feel it for the whole colony, because by the time I hit to certain individuals and places on the Freedom Trail in Boston, in the 15, 16 places, you gotta have a feeling for what's going on up and down the whole East Coast, and how these colonies are being birthed, and how they're different governments. They're responding to government and governing themselves in a different way. So 10 minutes, Crash Course does a pretty good job. I really like this guy. He's quirky like I am. So I think you'll enjoy this. But this gives a little more historical background, and we'll end with this. We'll pick up next time on Palm Sunday looking at the places in the Freedom Trail, because this will start, or actually, wait a minute, pause, because right into the 1700s there's a big event that happens that's called the Great Awakening. Have you heard of that? Great Awakening? And so I need to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll jump into the Freedom Trail, hopefully the whole time next Sunday. But feel this so you can get an idea of what's going on up and down the coast. Like, did you know who the colony was that were in northern Manhattan? We'll be going to New York, seeing the sites there and the Statue of Liberty and Ground Zero. But in northern Manhattan, there was a colony that came over, and they were called New Amsterdam. Remember, there was New England. Everybody's getting their piece of the pie. That's the Dutches. So anyway, watch this. 10 minutes.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to cram 150 years of American history into one video. Why? Well, many American history classes don't cover the colonial period at all, because most major American history tests have like one question about it. Mr. Green, so this isn't going to be on the test? That's awesome, because I have some flirtatious notes to exchange with Jessica Alvarez. Yeah, me from the past. So listen, would you rather do well on one test or lead a richer, more productive life as a result of having a better understanding of the complicated factors that led to the creation of the greatest nation in history? Stan, can I get a libertage? So listen up, me from the past. It's time to bask in our own greatness. And by greatness, I mean morally dubious dominance over people who would have been just fine without us. So contrary to popular mythology, colonial America was more than just Jamestown and Massachusetts. There was, for instance, New Amsterdam. The tale goes that Dutch traders bought the island of Manhattan from Lenape Indians for $24 in 1624. That isn't quite true, but it contains a truth. The Dutch traders who founded their colony were businessmen, and New Amsterdam was above everything else a commercial venture. This is still true in New York, actually. I mean, Manhattan is all about Wall Street. In fact, Crash Course writer and history teacher Raoul Meyer is believed to be the last person living on the island of Manhattan who does not work for an investment bank. So the Dutch let anyone into New Amsterdam who could help them turn a profit, including Jews and even Quakers, but they didn't like Indians very much. In fact, they drove them out of the colony. But anyway, the $24 the Lenape supposedly got for New England was $24 more than the Dutch got when the English took over the colony in 1664 by sailing 4 frigates into the harbor and asking for the colony in a threatening voice. So New Amsterdam became New York, which was a mixed blessing. The population doubled in the decade after the English takeover, but English rule meant less economic freedom for women who, under the Dutch, were able to inherit property and conduct business for themselves. And under the English, free black people lost a lot of the jobs they'd been able to hold under the Dutch. Things were better in Pennsylvania, so much so that it was known as the best poor man's country, which admittedly in the 17th century was a low bar to jump over. Given by Charles II to this guy, William Penn, in 1681, Pennsylvania was a huge tract of land roundabout here. The land included contemporary Pennsylvania and Delaware and New Jersey, but we've made an editorial decision not to talk about New Jersey here on Crash Course due to my long-standing anti-New Jersey bias. So Penn wanted his colony to be a haven for Quakers because he was a Quaker, as you know if you've ever seen a container of Quaker oats. Quakers were a pretty tolerant bunch, except when it came to slavery, which they opposed vehemently. And under Penn's leadership, the colony showed remarkable religious toleration and also an amazing respect for Indian communities, but then, after Penn was gone, yeah, the usual. In 1737, Pennsylvania colonists perpetrated one of the most famous frauds of colonial America, the walking purchase. Indians agreed to cede a tract of land bounded by the distance a man could walk in 36 hours, but the clever Governor James Logan hired a bunch of fast runners who marked out territory much larger than the Indians anticipated. Quakers had to resort to such tricks because they were pacifists. I should also mention that they weren't particularly fond of loose living. The government prevented swearing and drunkenness, for instance, but it was still pretty great compared to the other colonies. More than half of the male population was eligible to vote, and Pennsylvania's dual promise of religious freedom and cheap land attracted a lot of German immigrants. Well, I should say German-speaking immigrants. There was, of course, not a Germany at the time, as many viewers of Crash Course World History have pointed out to me. And now let us venture south, where we will find many mosquito-borne illnesses and somewhat less abolitionist sentiment. In 1663, English King Charles II gave 8 proprietors the right to set up a colony just north of the Spanish-controlled Florida to serve as a buffer. This became South Carolina, and its original settlers came from the sugar colony of Barbados, which helps to explain why they were so awesome at slavery. They tried to enslave the Indians and ship them to the Caribbean, but when that didn't work out, they began to import African slaves. We're going to talk a lot more about slavery in future episodes, but for now, just bear in mind it sucked. Okay, so in the last quarter of the 17th century, the British colonies in the Americas experienced a series of crises. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the document, I get it right, no shock, I get it wrong, shock. Okay, we accuse Sir William Berkeley as guilty of each and every one of the same, and as one who has traitorously attempted, violated, and injured His Majesty's interests here by a loss of a great part of his colony and many of his faithful, loyal subjects, by him betrayed and in a barbarous and shameful manner exposed to the incursions and murder of the heathen. And we do further declare these ensuing persons in this list to have been his wicked and pernicious counselors. Both wicked and pernicious, those are some terrible counselors. Okay, so this guy clearly hated William Berkeley, who I happen to know was governor of Virginia. Particularly upset about the colonists being incurred upon and murdered by the heathen, that is, the Native Americans. I mean, I have a guess, but I'm not brimming with confidence. The one person I know who hated William Berkeley was Nathaniel Bacon. Yes! Yes, yes! No shock for me and no pleasure for you, you schadenfreudic Crash Course viewers. So Nathaniel Bacon arrived in Virginia in 1673 and led an armed uprising against Governor Berkeley just 3 years later. And just to be clear, he was mad not because Berkeley did a poor job protecting colonists from Indians, but because Berkeley wouldn't allow them to kill more Indians and take more land. Berkeley had already given all the really good land to his cronies, those aforementioned wicked and pernicious counselors, leaving men like Bacon with serious beef. I hate myself. Before the rebellion was quelled by the arrival of English warships, Bacon burned Jamestown and made himself ruler of Virginia and looted Berkeley's supporters' land. 23 of the rebels were hanged, but not Bacon, who died shortly after taking control from, you guessed it, Dysentery. Dang it, dysentery! It's called history, not dysentery story. Bacon's Rebellion is sometimes portrayed as an early example of lower-class artisans and would-be farmers rising up against the corrupt British elite, which I guess kind of. But the biggest effects of the rebellion were 1, a shift away from indentured servants to slaves, and 2, a general desire by the English crown to control the colonies more. Okay, so in 1686, King James II really tried to put the hammer down by consolidating Connecticut, Plymouth, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New York, and East and West Jersey into one big mega colony called the Dominion of New England. Its near-dictatorial ruler was former New York Governor Edmund Andros, who proceeded to appoint his own officials and lay his own taxes without even consulting any of the elected assemblies. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on your perspective, a major event in British history reversed this policy, the Glorious Revolution. Now, thankfully, this isn't Crash Course British history, or it would quickly turn into Crash Course John is Bored history. But the upshot is that Britain got a fancy new royal family from Holland, which sparked uprisings in the colonies, and Andros was thrown into a Boston jail as the colonies reasserted their independence. And these new guys imposed the English Toleration Act of 1690, which decreed that all Protestants could worship freely. As Toleration Acts go, this one wasn't that tolerant. I mean, it still discriminated against Jews, but it did mark the end of the Puritan experiment. No longer would membership in a Congregationalist church be a requirement for voting in general court elections. Property ownership would now be the determining factor. And Massachusetts would now have a governor from England, not from a company board residing inside the colony itself. This was the context for one of the most talked about events in colonial history, the Salem witch trials. A lot of ink has been expended on this incident, and the interpretations of it are numerous and controversial, so I'm just going to point out that when the witch trials, which claimed the lives of 14 of the nearly 150 women and men accused of witchcraft, happened in 1691, New England as a colony had basically just failed in its religious mission. The Tolerance Act meant that people in Massachusetts would have to accept even Quakers as virtual equals. Quakers! So it's not surprising that colonists would look for scapegoats or that their male leaders would seek to reassert their gender dominance. Okay, to talk about colonial American economics, let's go to the thought bubble. Most colonists were farmers or worked on farms, and they were mostly small, unlike the giant plantations that predominated in the Caribbean. Since New England contains relatively little in the way of tropical diseases and was increasingly free of Native Americans, the colonial population there skyrocketed, so fast that families began to run out of land, so second and third sons increasingly had to go make their way in growing coastal cities. We'll talk about this more in future episodes, but for now, let's just note the idea of a person owning a small farm and the idea of freedom are pretty closely intertwined in the early part of American history. It's more of an amber waves of grain place than a behold this metropolis place. In fact, they were richer than any other colonial elites. Were they rich enough to dominate the Constitutional Convention? Time will tell. Now, not everyone was a farmer or a slave. There were growing numbers of artisans in the colonies. Although British colonial policy discouraged local manufacturing, the growing population in America meant that there was certain to be a market for locally produced goods, especially clothing and metalwork. Remember, one of the heroes of the American Revolution, Paul Revere, was a silversmith. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So that variety of jobs leads us nicely to our last topic today, colonial society. Although Americans like to think of themselves as classless, pun intended, that's not really the case. I mean, the colonies definitely had an elite ruling class, especially in the South, that did what it could to perpetuate itself. George Washington's father and grandfather were both justices of the peace, an important role in colonial times, meaning that George Washington had deeply elite roots. So that was the top of colonial society, and at the bottom was a growing number of poor people. While it's never good to be poor, it was much better to be poor in the colonies than it was in England or much of the rest of Europe, which is why people kept indenturing themselves to get here. America had lots of food, and there was the possibility of maybe someday getting some land, provided you didn't die of dysentery. Oh, and also provided you weren't a woman. Married women in 18th century colonial America generally couldn't own property, and husbands usually willed their land to their sons and their personal items to their daughters, meaning that almost all landowners were male. In the earliest days of colonization, when everyone was needed to ensure the survival of the colonies, women had a greater role in the economy, although they were still expected to be wives and mothers above all else. Male dominance was written into law and solidified in practice. Women's work was mostly confined to the home, and especially for lower-class women, it involved a lot of drudgery. As one woman, Mary Cooper, wrote in her diary in 1769, "I am dirty and distressed, almost wearied to death. This day is 40 years since I left my father's house and come here, and here have I seen little else but hard labor and sorrow. And that's actually a good place to end, because it reminds us that history is about much more than the lives of kings like James II and rebels like Nathaniel Bacon. And while history classes and exams tend to focus on those kinds of men, and they were mostly men, the real story of history is about regular people trying to take care of their families and not die. The colonial era often gets skipped for its lack of large-scale drama, but those small-scale dramas can be found in abundance. Next week, we'll go back to all that great men and dramatic events crap when we start talking about the American Revolution.
For those who just came in, teaching an American Christian Heritage tour in between. Talked about the Jamestown settlement, 1608 up to Plymouth in 1620. The Great Migration from 1620 to 40. That filled in some other areas from Virginia to Pennsylvania to the Salem witch trials. And next week, we'll go into the Great Awakening and the American Indian Wars, all to set up our track through Boston and the Freedom Trail